Got it. Excellent. Excellent. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to our September Beyond Black History Month presentation. It's good to see you all. We'll have other folks joining here over the next few minutes and we'll let them in. But we have, as we have for now more than a year, a wonderful program designed for you today. A very special guest. You'll notice we have a number of Crumps on our Zoom today, and Jean and Linda, our education committee chairs, will explain why we have this proliferation of Crumps with us this afternoon. So I'm going to be quiet and welcome all of the Crumps and all of you, and hand this over to Jean and Linda Crump.
Thank you, David. The Beyond Black History Month committee is pleased to announce that we're starting our second year, and this September is the one from baseball to the stars about Nate Crump. And the October Beyond Black History Month program is about an African odyssey. One of our members had a tour sponsored to Africa. So she's going to explain everything she learned and everything she saw in Africa. And that is going to be a good program. I think there is a Crump fever in this program because Nate Crump is my father's first cousin, and I believe that makes Nate my second cousin. And his son Lloyd is here, and his nephew Henry is here. So we're all Crumps, and we're all here to talk about Nate and his impact on Lloyd and Nate and Henry and everybody else who came in contact with him. So without further ado, I think I'd like to do the video of Nate Crump, and then we'll begin the program after the video.
Okay, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And let's see if I can do this. You know, some of us that are well-versed in sharing screens are better than others, but I think I got it. Okay. So let's go.
In 1948, North St. Louis native Nate Crump had a big life decision to make: play in the Negro Leagues with the Kansas City Monarchs or go to college. That way he could fulfill his dream of being a scientist. While most may have chosen athletics, Crump chose academics.
I had a friend who played with the Monarchs, and he was telling me all about the situation when they play little towns and we couldn't go to the hotels or anything like that. So if somebody in the town didn't take you in, then you slept in the bus.
While he chose not to play baseball, he did have some highlights as a baseball player in the Negro Leagues. While playing with the Monarchs in exhibition games, he got to play against Dizzy Dean's barnstorming tour team. A moment he shared with Dizzy is one he'll never forget.
Dizzy Dean took Elson and me aside, put his arm around us, and I looked up at him, and he's a big guy. One of the things that he was doing was telling us not to be nervous.
This past week, Crump celebrated his 102nd birthday and says all these years later, he made the right move. He'd go on to work for NASA, where he helped with multiple well-known space flight missions.
I worked about 20-some years in the space program. And I came in at the tail end of the Mercury program, which was #1, and Gemini.
While his decision of academics over athletics was more than 70 years ago, Crump still stresses the importance of academics to young athletes today.
As the times go on now, it's going to be even harder for them to get ahead if they don't have academics in there or have a degree of something.
For News 4 Sports, I'm Brian Kennedy.
Okay, we're going to start our program, but there is a little footnote. Nate suffered hospitalization, I think, on Tuesday night and all day yesterday. And I talked with Lloyd and Henry, and Nate is progressing well. He is out of harm's way. but he'll be in the hospital, I think, for a week or so, and then he'll return to his home. So we didn't want to cancel the program. We're doing the best we can because we had 3 or 4 sessions with Nate before his hospitalization. So we'll do the best we can and do the program from baseball to the stars. And I'd like to introduce Nathaniel Lloyd Crump. And if you'd spotlight Lloyd while I read his biography. Dr. Crump, Nate, is from the University of Chicago, Department of Obstetrics and Gynecology. His academic training is the University of Chicago, Department of Obstetrics and Gynecology and residential program. He is board certified in obstetrics and gynecology, and his professional employment, which he retired from, was the University of Chicago, Department of Obstetrics and Gynecology. Our next Crump is Reverend Henry Crump. And if you spotlight Henry Crump, I'll read his biography. 83 years ago, Henry came into this world to the union of Archie and Lois Crump. At the age of 17, joined the United States Marine Corps, where he did his basic training in San Diego. His tour of duty was Hawaii, where he reached the rank of Lance Corporal. After the Marine Corps, he moved back to St. Louis, Missouri. There, continued to further his education in teaching until retirement. At the age of 32, he accepted the call to the ministry, where he had the extreme pleasure of pastoring 2 churches in the metropolitan area, while at the same time still teaching. He's retired from education for a number of years, 28 to be exact, and pastoring for a number of years, 30. Now fully retired and is currently still ministering along with teaching. I'd like to introduce Nate Crump and Lloyd Crump. Now, we go back many years. I've visited St. Louis to visit my grandparents, and that's how we first met, Nate and then Lloyd. And then my father, Walter Crump, is Archie Crump, Henry's father, and Nate Crump, Lloyd's father, and they were contemporaries back in St. Louis many years ago. So I'd like to start off by saying Nate led a very wonderful life. He went to Lincoln University in 1942 and graduated with a degree in chemistry in 1948. He was a fond member of Kappa Alpha Psi, and in 1943, that was his chapter. He went to the Air Force from 1943 until 1946. And then we get into the history of Nate. Nate played exhibition games at Sportsman Park in St. Louis, Missouri with the Kansas City Monarchs baseball team. Nate played outfield and right field, and the Kansas City Monarchs were members of the Negro National League Baseball. Lloyd, do you remember anything about your father and the people he mentioned in the video beyond Elston Howard?
No, I think that was before my time. I was born in 1952. I remember watching him play baseball, but I was very small at the time.
Nate said he played with Buck O'Neill, Jackie Robinson, Larry Doby, Dizzy Dean, Elston Howard, Hank Thompson, and Willard Brown, just to name a few of the people that he played with. And there was a point in his career where he had to make a decision. And he talked to Dizzy Dean, and I think he talked to Elston Howard, and they explained to him the conditions of playing Negro National League Baseball. Does that ring a bell with you, Henry or Nate, the things he talked about at that time?
No, because I was still a young man at the time. In fact, my earliest recollection of Nate was during the time that he played at Tandy Park. And excuse me. And afterwards, you know, his walking home And I know at that time they lived on Whittier, perhaps Aldine, maybe even Garfield. So I know he lived in the three places. But he would walk by the house, and we were all poor. And as a matter of fact, we lived about 2 blocks from Sumner High, which is across the street from Tandy Park. And Nate would be walking home, and sometimes he would share the responsibility with my mother of giving her a piece of change so that we could have meals during the week. But other than that, I really didn't know anything about Nate's career until I started working with my auntie, who sold Polish sausage and hot dog, maybe pig ears, and soda water at Tandy Park. And Nate would come across the street to buy hot dogs or whatever it was he ate and a soda water, and then go back to play baseball. But that's the earliest contact that I had with him, you know. And so I do appreciate what he did for me when I was a kid. And however, that's I can't share anything about who he played with or whom or for whom, except I know at that time he was playing for Scullin.
I recall talking with Nate about the life of a professional baseball player back in the early 30s and late 30s and early 40s. He remarked about how hard it was for a young man to play in this town and this town and this town. And he couldn't go into the restaurants at those places. They had to bring the food out to him. And the only place he could eat the food was on the bus. And he mentioned that in the video, that it was a hard life to play Negro National League baseball. And it wasn't a life that he wanted to be a part of. He enjoyed baseball. He enjoyed playing baseball. He enjoyed the friends he made in baseball. And I mentioned those names before, and they're all historic names. But he wasn't cut out to be a hard-nosed baseball player and play on those teams that didn't accommodate him a good first-class hotel. And he had to stay on the bus when he couldn't find somebody in those towns to put up baseball players. So he said, when Dizzy Dean and him were talking, he mentioned Elston Howard. He said, you know, this isn't a life that I want to do. I've got other aspirations. I'd like to go on to my education. So he did go to college, but when he was in college, he came back to St. Louis in the summers and still played baseball. And he played baseball well enough for the next 10 years or so to be honored by the St. Louis Amateur Hall of Fame. And he was inducted into the St. Louis Amateur Hall of Fame. And that selection was, I think, in 1990 or so. And based on his participation in baseball and his love of the game and the things he sacrificed for the game, he was asked to be on the selection committee. So he selected other people to be a member of the St. Louis Amateur Hall of Fame. And he was an active member for 28 or 30 years. I think he's still on the Amateur Hall of Fame selection committee, but he doesn't attend the meetings. And as the video acknowledged, Nate is 102 years old. So he has a plethora of information about the Negro National Leagues and about his education. So he was inspired by a doctor. Lloyd, do you remember the doctor who inspired Nate?
Well, two. One is his professor, teacher at Lincoln University, Dr. Monty Taylor, who was part of the Manhattan Project, and then Dr. David Duguid in St. Louis, who really gave him his first really unpaid job in chemistry. So they both, I remember Dr. Duguid, and I remember Dr. Taylor, both remarkable people. And and both very deliberate. So I can understand where maybe, because as you may have mentioned, he not only did he like baseball, but at least one time his batting average was 500, which you don't, at least I haven't seen that too often. And
Not recently.
not recently. So, but Dr. Taylor, Monty Taylor, was his professor at Lincoln University. Later, he was chairman of the Department of Chemistry at Howard University, and someone who I met at the urging of my father. And Dr. Duguid remained a lifelong friend, even after my father moved on to other aspects of his career.
So his first job after graduating from Lincoln University is working at the Universal Match Company. And do you know primarily what he did at the Universal Match Company, Lloyd?
My understanding is that he did a lot of chemistry on pyrotechnics and flammable materials and microanalytic materials. So he dealt with very small particles of flammable materials there. And that jump-started him to his career.
He worked there for 4 or 5 years, and later he joined McDonnell Aircraft, again in pyrotechnics, working with flammables, combustibles, and things like that for the aircraft to keep them safe. And he served at McDonnell Aircraft and then later became McDonnell Douglas for about 26 years, from 1962 to 1987. And that's when McDonnell Douglas, McDonnell Aircraft got a lot of NASA contracts. They were building up the space program, and they were looking for talented people around the United States who had experiences with combustibles, pyrotechnics, heat shields, and the like. So he worked on several programs. He worked on the Mercury program. I think that was the two astronauts together. And he was instrumental, I say that now. I say he was instrumental in creating or working on the heat shield to bring the astronauts back from orbiting back into the Earth's atmosphere. And there were a whole bunch of experiments that he had to do. He had a lab, he had people working with him, and they were working on the various types of tiles that were impervious to combustion, that were impervious to the heat from the reentry. And I think he learned a lot and gave a lot to NASA on these contracts. Do you have anything to add or say about those types of contracts he did at that time? Henry, Lloyd, Nate?
Well, a lot of he's not the most talkative person to begin with, but a lot of the work he did for Mercury, Gemini, the shuttle, the space lab, he would come home with secret and top secret clearance. So I didn't, if I were able to understand it, he wouldn't talk about it anyway. And but he would bring home things that he would work on and try to explain things that were above my head at the time. The only anecdotal kind of humorous, I guess it's not humorous, thing that I can remember is that after the NASA contracts went over to another aerospace organization, that's when you had in the news that the heat shield failed. So I always thought it was because my dad was not working on it at the time. I don't know, but I'll say that's the case. So.
And we really don't know that because it's all top secret. So if it went over and he wasn't working on it, Lloyd, that's probably what I'm going to say too, because Nate and I talked about things we could talk about that weren't top secret security clearances. So he said, I can't talk about those things. I said, Nate, I'm not going to ask you about those things in terms of your top secret clearances, but I do want to talk about what you did with the Mercury, the Gemini, the Apollo, and the Space Lab programs. And he talked about, he didn't talk very much, but when he did talk about that, he said, well, I did a lot of scientific things based on my experience with pyrotechnics, combustibles, things that would protect the astronauts on reentry, because that was the biggest thing they were dealing with. They figured out how to go up in the air and out of orbit. That was fairly simple compared to bringing them back down, because when they came back down, there was a lot of friction in the atmosphere. So they had to come up with something that was going to withstand 2,000 or 3,000 degrees of heat to not burn up and roast the people inside. So that was a crucial part of the space program. And I'm saying he wasn't instrumental in it, but he had an instrumental part to play among the other labs and the other technicians on the space program.
Let me add to that. The only thing that I can remember is him sharing a couple of stories. Well, they were about cleanliness and about not going to space and taking germs with them, nor bringing any back. So he had to find out a pristine atmosphere for the astronauts in order to go to space and to bring them back. And one incident he did share, but he didn't share it alone, only with me, but there were a lot of other people present, was that one astronaut came back and he had a burning sensation in his eyes. And so they did a lot of analytical work to find out what that burning sensation was. And they found out that when the astronaut had tried to urinate and whatever it is they do, some of it splashed into his eyes, and his eyes was burning from that. But that's the story that he shared with me. But other than that, you know, everything, like Lloyd said, was top secret. And I do know that he did tell me, because I asked him about pictures, and he said, no, they didn't even allow them to bring cameras on the premises.
And I recall that when the astronauts did re-enter the Earth's atmosphere, they were quarantined for 2 or 3 weeks someplace, so they wouldn't bring back, as you say, germs from space or whatever.
Right.
So it's a different process now than it was when it first started.
Absolutely.
Yes, and I think he relayed the fact he had 3 labs actually at McDonald's and McDonnell Douglas, and there would be times when he would come home a little frustrated because he had people working under him. And certainly he was one of only a few people of color, but he had a number of people working under him that he would train in microanalytic chemistry and things in parts per million, parts per billion, which is one of his labs. And after they reached a certain level, he had to fight to keep his employees, and he never would go into details about that, but it certainly he was troubled by it.
For the people who came on to the Zoom later, I said that unfortunately, Nate had a hospitalization that occurred, I think, Tuesday night.
Absolutely.
And he currently is in the hospital. Henry has talked to him, and I will talk to him probably Friday or tomorrow. I wanted to talk to him through Henry because I didn't want to interrupt him. But he appears to be healing. He appears to be getting stronger. He appears to be getting better. He'll be in the hospital through probably Monday or Tuesday, and then he'll come home. So for 102 years old, this is very serious. And I think he's going to survive this.
Right.
Being involved in the space program, I'm certain he met some astronauts. I don't know if it's John Glenn or anybody else, but can you tell me if if Nate met any astronauts either directly or through somebody else?
I really don't remember him.
I think
Elaine.
Nate Jameson came up, Henry.
Well, Mae Jameson is, well, no, that's me.
Okay, Lloyd.
Okay.
Mae Jameson, I met her sister. I'm currently in Chicago now, but I'm from St. Louis, but I went to Washington U Medical School, and her sister, Ada Jemison, and I were in the same medical school class. 6 out of about 105 people of color. But so you're thrown together to be friends. And then at our graduation, her little sister May came to the graduation and we met, and very pleasant, but I don't even think she was in medical school at the time.
So as far as you know, then, that's the only contact he had with an astronaut? I'm certain he talked about them or did things for them, but he couldn't tell me anything about that.
I don't know if he had contact with them, and I don't know, but he does relay a story of the astronauts, of course, were very good pilots, and he relays a story of them flying into McDonnell Douglas, which is now Boeing, but I think upon landing they crashed the plane. So I hope he didn't meet those two. So.
I think he worked in the space industry through McDonnell Douglas for, I think, 26 years or so. And I can't tell you how many things he probably did in the safety of the astronauts, doing the reentry tiles, doing all those things that brought those rockets back to Earth safely. But he's got a lot of stories in his mind that he just can't tell. And it was, I imagine it was a very inspirational, a very important time in his life. And I want to know, do you think he's inspired you, Lloyd, and you, Henry, to go on and do things better or to be better in doing things?
Henry, you want to start, or I can?
Well, you can go ahead. As I said, my inspiration from Nate was just to be a better person, because I saw how good a person he was by his sharing the responsibility of being, I guess, what you could call, well, a brother to his brother, and then taking the responsibility of a father to me, which his brother did not do. He moved away some 60 years in California. And I guess that's my inspiration from Nate, is to just be the best person I can.
I would ditto that. I mean, I think my father, to his credit, and he would never say it, has really kept the family much closer.
Right.
Because all the brothers split up, and he was the person who would call everyone, and still calls everyone on the holidays and whenever, and gets them together, even when there's squabbles and everything between the people. And his generosity, I don't really know exactly what he has done. I know he used to also help my first cousin, who's now deceased, in California, and she would come by and need some help, and I'd come home, and I do come home every once in a while and get my hair cut, and one day the barber told me, he said, "Well, I never charged your dad, because if it weren't for the money that he gave me, I wouldn't have the barber shop." And I didn't know that in well until I was an adult. But he's as a as a child, I mean, all children, I think if you have good parents, you want to emulate them and do the best you can to be either them. My mother was a teacher, my dad a chemist, of course, and so I wanted to be, I think probably a chemist at first, and then a doctor. But he never let me waver from thinking that that's not what I was going to be ever. And he was strict in a kind way, in that if I came home with good grades in grade school, he would ignore those. And if I had, for example, an A in some class, but I had a B or a C in another class, he would be quite disappointed in me for having a B or a C, which bothered me immensely. And but later on in life, it made me realize that as my grades came up, and I realized that I didn't want to tell my dad, even in college, I didn't have a good grade, that that I, in the back of my mind, I could see my dad looking at me saying, well, how did you do? And so obstacles that occurred in my life, when you talk about just difficulty in learning, being a person of color, disparities, racism, whatever, I never ever let it stop me because I knew I couldn't. And it was an obstacle that I had to get over if I wanted to get where I wanted to be. And then later on in life, as a associate professor at University of Chicago, there were a number of people of color who I taught, both as residents and medical students and faculty, I guess. And as you can imagine, in any academic situation or anywhere, they would, I became, because I was older and had gone through the ropes, a role model, kind of like Charles Barkley, who says, I don't want to be a role model for anybody. And I didn't want to be a role model for anybody, but you kind of fall into it. And they would come and talk to me, and I would give them a talk. But I remember the lessons my father had taught me is that even though you have obstacles, and you're going to have them, and certainly they're there, you have to learn to fight your battles, and you have to learn that even with the obstacles, if you want to get where you want to be and be the best that you can be, you just have to rise above that and get to where you want to go. So I think that is the biggest lesson my dad has ever given me.
Lloyd, I think in that response to my question, I think you glossed over a very important fact, and that is, for every great man, there's a greater woman behind it. And that was your mother, Ruby. Can you tell me what Ruby did for your father that made him continue with the space program or on the road to success?
Well, I think the first thing is that, as he tells me, the reason why he didn't go into baseball is because of her. And he realized that he would not have her if he went into baseball. So he tells me that the only reason why I'm here now is because she was the inspiration for him staying and going on. So, and like you said, every person has a great woman, and she was certainly great and very kind. And also she would, when my dad would tell me my grades were not up to what he thought they should be, she would say yes and then put her arm around me and say, but you know, you can do better, and make me feel better. And quite inspiration, a very good teacher. And so, and I think I probably was a mama's boy. So, so I think for people who are know what that means, you have to have someone who's very nurturing, and she was certainly that.
Well, I'm not going to dispute you being a mama's boy, but Henry smiled when I mentioned Ruby. And I'm certain there were some stories that he had with Ruby and Nate growing up that were inspirational or uplifting or that just supported Henry.
Well, I can remember some of the stories that he would share with me when she lived in Webster Groves, that he would ride the streetcar out to see her. And one night he stayed so long that he had to walk home. And walking home would have been quite a chore for him because from Webster Groves to St. Louis, and I don't know where he was living at the time, but I do know that the family moved from Whittier to Garfield to Aldine to Margaretta, and that's where the four houses that he did live in. But that was funny because he would share the stories about him going out to visit Ruby and staying so long. But Ruby was a school teacher, and he and she went to college together at Lincoln University. And I think is that where he met her, Lloyd? Or
He, he was in the Army, and he came back. It was his education was interrupted by military service, and he
Air
came
Force.
back on the GI Bill, I think it was. And then my mother was out of school, and he went back to Lincoln and finished his degree. And a lot of the stuff I just learned. She brought some of her students to Lincoln to to show what Lincoln University was like, and so he met her through her field trip to Lincoln University.
Right. Yeah, well, that's kind of the story I remember, but I didn't recall that right off the top of my head. But I do know that he was well, if he hadn't married Ruby, he probably wouldn't have been married at all.
I think Ruby took care of that.
Right.
Around 1964 and 65, Vice President Hubert Humphrey and Secretary of Labor Willard Wirtz, he was one of the 65 African Americans chosen for the Plans for Progress, a forerunner of the affirmative action program of the federal government. Do you recall anything about that in his conversations? Because I know he went back to Washington several times.
I wish he could be here to tell you about that. I remember he is very proud of his work for the Plans of Progress, and in the birth of the affirmative action program. And I thought it was amazing that he would actually be able to go to Washington, D.C. and meet with the vice president and his group of 65 people that were, I guess, picked through the Urban League. He was one of the people picked by the Urban League. Is that right, Henry?
That's right. That's correct.
And he would go there, and so I guess it's the birthplace of the affirmative action program, and that's it is certainly, I think, something that was very instrumental in everyone's life, including me. It again, as I said, I went to Howard for undergrad, and then I went to Washington University, and I had the grades and all the criteria to be a medical student at Washington University, but there were 5 people of color was 6 people of color in the class of about 100. It's either 105, 110 medical students at Washington University. One was Japanese, and and I knew because we had a dean of a dean for people of color. I can't remember the exact title at the university, but we became very good friends. And I can tell you that they had 5 people at Washington U, but they wouldn't have 6. So no matter what your credentials were, and they wouldn't have 6. And I can tell you one little small story. I know we're running out of time. Is that my first test at Washington U, to tell you how I think you have to rise above adversity, was in microbiology. And I studied hard, and took me a long time to finish that test. It was very hard because you self-select in medical school for people who are brainy. And but everyone except for the people of color got up and did really well. Well, not everyone, maybe 20 people out of the 105. We were really struggling. And I passed the test. And but I'm like, why in the world all these people get up so fast and get out? And I'm sitting here wiping my brow. I had more hair then, and then and take so long. And we found out later that some of the 5 of us, we found out that most of the class had the answers to the test. They had study questions that had been passed down from year to year, and they circulated among everyone except for us. And I said, oh, this is not good. And so I went to an instructor, the professor there at the time, who was very fair. In fact, everyone thought he was Caucasian, but I knew he was not. A friend, we actually went to church and together. And I told him, I said, everyone had the test. And that's why, it took us, it was so hard for us to pass the test, and we had to struggle with it. And I, of course, expected him to do something to get back and throw the test out, and of course they graded on the curve, and to get back and say, well, we're done with that. And so he told me, Lloyd, because he knew me from church, and he said, well, the next test, you need to get the questions. And so I was really taken aback at that, but I went back and told my friends, and we all decided, including Ada Jemison, who was very friendly, that we had to get the questions. And so we all decided that even though we're a group and we huddle together and protect ourselves, we can't do it to the detriment of our education. And so we immediately became friendly with everyone else in the medical school class. And the next test, we had the questions. So it was on an even keel, which is all we ever asked for.
So Nate is 102 years old. He almost played professional baseball with the Negro Leagues. He was an astronaut trainer by his chemistry with creating those combustibles and those heat shields. And he was a forerunner of the affirmative action with the plans for progress. So I think he did a lot in those 102 years. and he inspired you two. He inspired me and my wife and my family. So it was a life well lived, and he's living it still.
Amen.
So I think I'm going to open it up to questions or comments from the audience. Do you have any questions or comments, Linda?
Jean, there are some that are in the chat, and so we'll do those first before we open it up to anyone else. So first of all, people are glad to hear that Nate is recovering, and that someone wondered, did he ever meet or know Katherine Johnson because of the connection with the space program?
I think I can answer that, because when Hidden Figures came out, I did ask him about that, and he said he was aware of the space program, but I believe that was in Florida.
Or Texas?
Yeah, Texas. But he didn't know them personally, but he knew of the struggles that they had, because we had the same struggles in Missouri.
Okay, I don't know if you can answer the second part. We wish Nate was here to answer it, but they wanted to know, what do you think is the secret to his longevity? And Henry, I think your dad lived pretty long too, didn't he?
Well, yes, he did. He checked out at 95 on July the 4th, about 7 years ago. Well, he would have been 104 now.
Okay.
And but he did have a long life. He would have been 96 on September the 1st of that year that he passed away, I think, which was 2015.
So somebody said that genetics may have a lot to do with it, because if Gene wants to mention his dad was in his 90s too. So you guys, you better take care of yourselves.
Well, that's true, but I'm planning personally, when I reach that 100 mark, that I'm going into negotiations.
Okay, so there's another question about when, well, and you might have said this, Gene, in the bio. What years was Nate actually at Lincoln?
He was at Lincoln from 1942 to 1948.
And then the other part of that question was about, when did he work for NASA? Do you remember the years he was doing contracts for NASA?
I think he started at McDonnell Douglas in 1962, and he served McDonnell Douglas through 1987. And that's when he got the contracts. That's when McDonnell Douglas got the contracts from NASA.
And then, Henry, you did mention about Hidden Figures, and people wondered, did Nate have any experiences that were similar to the disrespectful situation and experiences that we witnessed in that film? Did he ever mention any of those? I know, Lloyd, you said something about employees and what to do to help employees, but just that kind of atmosphere of disrespect, did he suffer that?
Yeah, absolutely. He would, as I said, he had 3 labs, and I don't think he got the recognition. And he would occasionally let it slip that his supervisor would say some disparaging remarks to him, and but that's about, as I said, my dad is kind of quiet. He didn't tell me the details, but I met one person who he mentioned was very disparaging.
But I imagine, Lloyd, that he went on and did his work. He did his supervising, and he didn't let that supervisor get under his skin dramatically.
That's correct. Yeah.
Yes, and I would add to that, I do know several people that worked in the lab with him, and they all speak highly of him, but you'd really have to know him. He's an overcomer rather than reactionary. I think he doesn't react very well. Although it may bother him, he doesn't let it show.
He has the demeanor of Lloyd, doesn't he?
I think he's got less of a temper than I do, perhaps.
Right.
So there were no more questions in the chat, but if anybody who's online wants to unmute and ask a question, I'd like to keep the three of them spotlighted so it's easy for us to hear their answers. So if anybody wants to unmute and ask a question, this is a great time to do it.
I know Fran Taylor is anxious to ask the question that she married a Kappa Alpha Psi man. What's your question, Fran?
Well, my question has already been answered. The question about the disparaging treatment and whatnot, because the things that we witnessed in that film were horrible, especially for people so gifted and so talented in making the contributions that they were making. So it is hard. You mentioned that he was an overcomer, but it is difficult in certain circumstances to be your best when you're faced with that kind of treatment. So thank you for that response. I suspected that there were probably some incidents that occurred, but he's an overcomer, as you mentioned, and it's evident that he made great contributions to this program.
Gene, I
And I
noticed
think-
Kappa is waving his hand back there, so he has something to
Yes,
say.
comment. First of all, very, very proud to know that the elder Mr. Crump is a member of the greatest fraternity in the world, Kappa Alpha Psi. But secondly, Dr. Crump, I know exactly what you mean about old tests, and on the old test, you don't really get the answers, but you get the questions. And if you get the questions, then you can figure out the answer. I will never forget being the only Black in my dental school class at Indiana University, class of 1961, having a professor stand up at the end of my first lecture. He just happened to be a minority person, a Japanese guy. And he said, all of you kids, except you colored kids and you Jewish kids, are welcome to join this dental fraternity.
Right.
The thing about that is that the dental fraternity had a library of the old test. And if I couldn't be in that fraternity, then I would be at a loss. Fortunately, my best friend, a white guy who sat next to me, became a member of that fraternity, and he gave me access to some of those things. But there are disadvantages that we have to overcome. And like like most of the Crumps are saying, you just have to overcome anyway.
That's right.
But I think we waste a lot of energy overcoming and not using that energy to create the problem, create the solution.
Right.
You know, we lose a lot of things trying to overcome, and we're not focusing on solving the problem.
Exactly.
Since we only have about 4 minutes left, I'm going to unspotlight all of you guys so that you can see everybody who's on this chat, because that's the only disadvantage of having spotlights, is that you just see that major person instead of everybody who's on the chat. So anybody else have anything they want to share? We do try to be respectful of time and make sure we end right at 5.
Before we finish, I'd like to again thank Nate Lloyd and Henry for their participation in a sort of change of the program because of the hospitalization of Nate. So I appreciate the both of you very much. And we look forward to getting Nate back on one of these Zooms just to introduce him, because we talked about him so much, to let you know that he still exists, and he does.
And if any of you came in late, we did start with a video. So go to the Asala website when it's posted, because it takes a couple of days before it's up, and look at that. So you'd get to hear his own voice, his own words, talking about some of the things he did. You will look at this man and not believe that he's 102.
Can I ask a quick question?
Sure. Alvin.
I got in probably about 10 minutes late, so I don't know if you already covered this, but I was just wondering if Nate was staying engaged with the space program. In particular, this latest thing that they're trying to send up, that they keep extending the date for the takeoff. Was he aware that that was in the works, and did he demonstrate any interest in it still?
Well, my dad he's very much aware, and actually actually pretty with it. He, in fact, that's him now. I'm gonna hang up on him.
Okay.
He's very much with the space program and so yes, he,
Lloyd, give him our best and know that we missed him and we hope we can see him again soon. But we understand it's more important to talk to Dad than to talk to us.
Dad, I'm in that meeting about you. All right, goodbye.
Well, we know he's okay.
He's all
Yeah,
right.
well,
He's quite with it, and I would have been a Kappa at Howard, but they broke someone's sternum when I was gonna pledge and
Oh.
threw him off.
yes, you know, and as Lloyd said, he is very much aware, and I did talk with him today. Well, I didn't talk to him personally, my wife did. He had physical therapy and he had turned his phone off, so he's aware of using the equipment that he has. And anyway, he had forgotten to turn it back on, but because we had called him several times to check on him. After this Zoom session, I believe my wife and I are going over to the hospital to visit him.
Please give him our regards.
Sure will.
Well, thank you.
Lloyd, myself, and my wife I have power attorney for him. So, but he's doing well.
And, you know, as one of the people on this, but didn't be an organizer in any way, I just want to thank you guys for trying to bring Nate's story forward. A dynamic person, a wonderful person. So glad that he has been part of our lives. I'm glad that we got to be with Ruby when she was still alive. And so a wonderful dynamic couple. I'm not surprised that Lloyd is who Lloyd is when those are his parents. So let's give a round of applause for these wonderful people. Thank you all. I'm going to stop the recording now, but I won't click off until everybody